So it's wonderful to be here with you today, Sandra. You might expect in preparing for this podcast that I read a few books, quite a few, in fact, and I do really read them. And I try and tease out the most stimulating, provocative, perhaps unconventional aspects of the book and the work. It wasn't that hard to do that with your book, I have to say. Mine masters the data science of predicting and changing behavior. I mean, it shook me both positively and negatively. I mean, it shook me to the core in terms of thinking about the opportunities of how we can use our digital footprints productively, ethically, and so forth. But also, gosh, what happens when it perhaps leads to unintended consequences or intended consequences. I love combinations, as listeners will know, between factors, and it's obviously tech and data science and psychology, which it makes you and the book and the work even more appealing. I mean, it's a really relevant topic. Many of us are worrying about how tech is invading, at worst, infusing, at best, our lives, and what to do about it. What can we do about it ourselves, as organizations, as leaders, and what should governments and regulators do? And you cover all of that in your work, your research, and this book. So congratulations to you. But before we delve in, let me welcome you to the show. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to hear that. I think you took away the pieces of the book that I enjoyed most writing, right? I think this tension, I'm sure we're going to dive in, but it's always nice to hear what people take away.
Absolutely, absolutely. So as I always do, I like to frame the conversations with sort of what are we actually talking about, and then we can dig in. So you talk about digital footprints. We probably have a sense of what that is, but just give us a layperson's description of what they are and, in a way, what they can tell us.
Yeah, so the way that I think of digital footprints are essentially all the traces that you leave as you interact with technology. And that could range anywhere from what psychologists would call explicit identity claims. So explicit identity claims are the things that you post on social media, right? So this is you telling yourself and the world, here's who I am, here's how I want to see myself, here's how I want others to see me. So those are very explicit cues to your identity that you intentionally put out there. But there's this entire other world that I think when it comes to media covering our data, it sometimes gets lost. And this is what psychologists would call behavioural residue. So those are all of the traces that you don't intentionally put out there. It's just they happen to be created as you interact with technology. That could be anything from your Google searches, right? Google searches is something that you don't typically think of as, oh, I want others to see necessarily what I'm typing in Google search bar, or the fact that you carry your smartphone with you 24/7, which means that there's someone really looking over your shoulder and recording pretty much every step you take. If you think of the GPS sensor, or kind of keeping track of who you communicate with, looking at call logs, and so on and so forth. So there's this whole swath of other data, again, ranging from your smartphone, your credit card spending, your Google searches, facial recognition, Alexa at home. Those are all pretty intimate insights into our daily lives and routines that we don't typically think of when we think of our digital footprints.
I bet many listeners and viewers will be taking gulp moments and wondering what residue have they left behind, and what is Big Brother and Big Sister telling us. Just general terms, and this may be a silly question, how conscious are we of what we leave behind in terms of, I guess, the psychological profile of ourselves? Now, of course, you mentioned there'll be certain posts that we put out there, which is us telling the world how we are, how we're feeling, and so on. You can probably get a sense of that. But all the rest of it, how surprising do you find it in your research that people, when they actually see it or sense it, or obviously get the interventions back, they go, wow, I didn't realize I was that type of person.
Yeah. For me, the interesting part is actually putting the pieces together, right? Because when I tell people, well, I can capture your GPS records and see where you go, or I can look at your purchase histories, or I can look at the stuff that you post on social media. When you think of these data points in isolation, it doesn't even feel that intimate, right? It's like, okay, maybe you do that. I was going to go to the grocery store, or maybe you know that I posted about my latest vacation in Miami. And in isolation, it's like, it's just one data point at a time, right? And that's not how we typically think of ourselves or how we think of other people. We think of us as like these holistic people who have certain characteristics that could range anywhere from, well, your personality. Are you more extroverted, more introverted, more neurotic, more emotionally stable, more organized, more disorganized? This is how we think of people typically. Now, the part that I think is surprising for listeners, and actually was very surprising to us about 15 years ago when we started this research, that when we take all of your data points and then we use like machine intelligence, and we can talk about this more, but essentially we translate these traces into something that is much more meaningful to us as humans. And this can go anywhere from, again, personality to your values, to your mental health, to intelligence. And that suddenly feels a lot more intimate. And I think that's surprising for people.
Absolutely. Well, gosh, I remember taking your personality test, and we'll put the link in for viewers and listeners. And I'm not a massive fan, nothing about yours, personality test and and everything that goes with it. But it was insightful to the point where I was like, oh, really? Gosh. But I'll put the link in. That'll be a nice teaser for listeners. But let's start positively, and we'll dive into the machine learning aspects in a moment. But there is this can be a force for good, is a force for good. There are ways that what you describe can be help us lead happier, healthier, better lives. Give us a few examples where you know it actually happens for real. It's not just an idea.
Yeah. No, happy to. And I think what we can gain from data actually happens at different levels. So the first thing is it can simply give us insights, right? There's many things that we've learned about psychology, the way that the human mind works, the way that human behavior expresses itself in daily life that we didn't know before. One of my favorite examples here, and this also shows you that it's not rocket science, right? When I talk about machine learning and AI, it often feels like it's this black box that we can't really penetrate. Oftentimes it's really simple. So the example that I like is essentially the use of first person pronouns. So in the language that people use, again, when they post on social media, when they communicate with their friends and family, the use of first person pronouns, which is I, me, myself, so references to the self. And what we've learned, just again, by looking at data and looking at the data of many, many people at the same time, is that they're an indication, not of narcissism, which was my first guess, by the way, but it's actually an indication of emotional distress. So people who use these first person pronouns more than the average person, they're just much more focused on the self, right? So it's I kind of like this thought experiment where you go back to a time when you felt somewhat sad or depressed or blue. You probably weren't thinking about the world's biggest problem, right? You were not thinking about how do I solve climate change? What happens to the wildfires? What you think about is yourself. You think about, well, yes, why am I feeling so bad? How do I get better? Am I ever even going to get better? So this inner monologue that we can't constantly monitor creeps into the language that we use. And now you can say this is an insight that allowed us as psychologists to understand something about human behavior in a way that we didn't before. But you can also think that this might actually be a potentially helpful tool for people to keep track of their mental health. So one of the things that we know, and now this is, I think, really directly tied to this question of how do we use it for good to help individuals and the people who generate the data, is that we know that it's really difficult once you suffer from something like depression, for example, to first of all reach out and get the help that you need, because you're currently so inward facing. You're not really able to necessarily reach out and get the support. Ideally, what we would do is we would catch this much earlier, right? Not when you're down in the valley and it's already too late. Yes. Ideally, we would very early on see, well, there's deviations from your behavior. And that could be you're using first person pronouns more. Some of my own work has looked at the ability of smartphones to detect early signs of depression. So you can imagine if you're not, based on your GPS records, you're not leaving the house as much anymore as you typically do. There's much less physical activity. Maybe you're not taking as many calls as you usually do. And it's not a fully diagnostic tool, right? So maybe you're just on vacation, you're having a great time and like a little bit more of a relaxing time. But it's like this early warning system that could tell you, or maybe someone that you love and that you nominate to receive notifications says like, might be nothing, but there's this deviation from your baseline. Why don't you look into this? I think this is one example where we get insights that are interesting for like from a scientific point of view, but also for individuals. And then the second piece of this, which is what I think of this as the treatment and the intervention piece, right? Yeah. Once we understand that someone might be suffering, now there's still this huge gap in supply and demand. So we know that for every 100,000 people who are looking for support when it comes to mental health challenges, there's 13 healthcare professionals. So there's this, and you can imagine this, it's like if you live on the Upper West Side or Upper East Side in Manhattan, you're not going to have a difficulty. You're not going to have a challenge finding a therapist because there's many. But if you live in other parts of the world, or you simply can't afford paying $500 for a therapy session, the alternative is, now that is kind of becoming more popular, is essentially have a virtual assistant, an AI, who is amazing at keeping up on the latest science, right? Because they've read the entire internet. They know, here's what we know the last couple of years has come out in terms of how do we treat depression, how do we treat PTSD. They're not perfect, right? And there's a need for putting guardrails in place when we use these agents. But if the counterfactual, if the baseline is you don't have access to any treatment at all, it's certainly an improvement. So those are just examples in the mental health space that I care a lot about, where it's both insights and then also ability to intervene.
Yeah, me too. I mean, they're great examples. I can think of fantastic and important applications. How much of us, if you were one of these people, feeling low in whatever description you'd have, how do you know how much to share? And the reason I put a rider on that is, there's always the long terms and conditions. There's the sort of click through. How much do I need to read? But also, how much do I trust the organization? And I'm sure there's examples, speaking personally, where I probably haven't read most of them if I trust that organization. However, another one, perhaps I don't know as much about, read some new headlines, I read it pretty analytically. Yeah. So how much do we need to check how much we're giving of our lives before we actually use and benefit from these new insights?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question, right? Because the same insight and the same ability to both peek into your psychology and then use that knowledge to potentially influence your behavior can be used in vastly different ways. So I think the mental health context is one where we have really nefarious examples. So Facebook was, I think, 2005 accused of essentially making very similar inferences about teenagers, whether they were suffering from low self-esteem, anxiety, depression, and then using that knowledge to sell them out to advertisers. So that's clearly a use case where you kind of take a step back and say this is highly unethical. Now, I think what we can do in terms of the entities that we trust, and there's actually, I think if we think future, even better ways, I mean, some of it is, like, if you know that in a mental health context, for example, it's usually made for people who already know that they have a history, right? So it could be something that gets facilitated through a doctor. It could be something that allows you to have very high levels of control over what type of data do you share, very high levels of transparency of, like, here's what's going to happen with that data. Now, ideally, you could take this even a step further and use these new types of machine intelligence where you don't even have to collect the data itself. So this is something that I describe in the book, and it's a technology that I think is going to be becoming mainstream in the next couple of years. And it breaks down this dichotomy between, well, you can either benefit from your data being out there, right? And I think the mental health context is one where the benefits are very obvious. But as you said, it's still, even if I read through all of the terms and conditions, they're very clearly explaining to me which data is being collected. I trust them because they seem to have my best interest at heart. It's a gamble because you never fully know if that changes in the future, right? So they might be working in my best interest right now, could be totally different if they get a new CEO tomorrow. So you still have to put some trust. And there's obviously also the risk of data breaches once an entity or company collects your data in a central space. What you can do with these new technologies, and it's called federated learning for the people who want to look it up. But the idea is that instead of you having to send all of your data to, let's say, this entity that you trust, a company who's trying to help you, what they can do is they can send the intelligence to you locally on your phone, because your phone is a supercomputer, right? Your phone is so much more powerful than the ones we used to launch rockets to space with a few decades ago. And so what they can do is they can essentially take everything that they've learned, again, maybe use a first person pronouns, maybe physical activity based on your GPS record, maybe like your call logs. They can send that intelligence to your phone. It locally updates. And it gives you locally a sense without you ever sending the data. It's like, okay, there seems to be something off. So you get this local trigger, but that doesn't necessarily need to be communicated back to the company. So if there is this entity out there that really takes acting in your best interest seriously, there's now ways in which they can do that without having to collect the data in the first place. And now, from a user point of view, that's much better, right? Because you know that in a way, it replaces trust with an inherently trustworthy system, because you don't need to trust them anymore to keep your data safe from data breaches or to not abuse it tomorrow, because they've never collected the data in the first place.
Wow. I mean, these federated learning, I guess, networks, platforms, are they, what were the names? You're not there as an agent for them or pitching, but just make it
Yeah.
real. Give us a few
No,
names.
so federated learning is essentially just the name of the type of tool. So it's like one type of machine learning, but there's quite a few companies pushing them and already using them. So Google might come as a surprise, but they're actually at the forefront of making these publicly like open source. So they're working a lot on developing these methodologies, and they use it in some of the search engines that they put out there, but they also make it open for other developers to use.
Yeah.
Same is true for Apple. So the way that Apple trains Siri, for example, so the speech recognition software, also happens locally. So they don't necessarily need to grab all of your speech data and save it in a central server. So it's definitely, it requires a little bit of rethinking of data structures, but at least the infrastructure is out there.
Well, that's a refreshing shift for both those companies that were very closed in their mindsets and practices and platforms. The flip side, then, you talk about creepy, manipulative, and downright harmful examples. I can think of a few leaders that come to mind, but let's not talk about them for name. But you talked about advertising there earlier about Facebook, or at least a case against Facebook about that. Give us some really shocking examples where you go, wow, that's not how it should work.
Yeah. So for me, what I always find fascinating is that when you look at the discussion in the media, we typically still talk only about privacy. It's like, well, there was a data breach, and like AT&T got hacked and T-Mobile got hacked. And we think of like, well, now someone can look into the most intimate aspects of our lives. For me, the really creepy part comes in when we take it to the next step, which is, well, once someone gets these insights into our lives, they can also influence our behavior, right? And I think of it as like they can open doors for us and they can close doors for us. So based on who they think we are, sometimes that's incredibly helpful and sometimes that's harmful. There's this one example in the book of a young kid, so like late teens, who actually was a college student but suffered from bipolar disorder, anxiety, and so on. So he took a break from college and was applying to a couple of jobs. So applied to a supermarket chain and kept getting rejected. And it turned out that essentially they had filtered him out based on a personality test. So coming back to you not liking personality tests, not always so surprising. So they had filtered him out because he was just honestly responding to the questions about his emotional stability. So for me, that's an example of like insights into who you are being used against you, right? And it's not just one door closes. If all the companies are using the same metrics, the same personality test, that means that you're suddenly filtered out across many different jobs. Take it to the data level. China, I think, is the most obvious case, where the social scoring that they implemented is essentially trying to understand who are you? What's your likelihood, for example, of engaging in a protest, of challenging the government? And if you're predicted to be one of those people who might be speaking up, you might not be allowed to enter Beijing. Right? And to me, that's this notion of it's not just that we're trying to understand who you are, but we're using it then to influence the path that your life can take or could have taken.
Yeah, that's really strong. That's really shocking. So let's you mentioned earlier about a company example. Imagine you were in a conversation now with a new CEO and she or he said to you, look, I've read your work. You've listened to that brilliant podcast with that Lancefield character. I know we do some of this stuff, whether it's in recruitment or assessments or with our customers, of course. What would be your main message as they're thinking about their blueprint for the organization, which they often do in the first 90, 100 days? What would be the main messages?
I mean, I think so. First one is don't stop at what's legal. You should really think about what's ethical, right? There's so much thought in companies being put into how do we get away with stuff in a way that's just borderline not illegal. And I think that shouldn't be the goal. And if you set the bar high, are you going to fail? Probably yes. But if you don't set it high in the first place, you're never going to get there. And I think there's a few relatively easy things that leaders can do that make it easier for everybody in the company to get behind it. So one thing that again, like coming back to Apple, one of the things that they do, which I really like, is they call it's a thought experiment that gets them to think through this notion of we might be capturing data in the here and now with this enthusiasm for the product that we're building, right? Like if you were kind of sitting in a meeting, and I've sat in like a few, like of engineers, business people, product managers talking about what they can do, and really kind of with this notion of we're going to help the consumer have a better experience. So there's like all this enthusiasm, optimism, and it's really hard for then someone to speak up and say, hey, but what about like data privacy and what about the risks of this? What they do is they have like this institution called the Evil Steve test. And the idea is like this thought experiment of what would happen if tomorrow we get completely different leadership, right? If tomorrow the CEO or even the next senior level at the top is, if they had completely different values and they were not using the data to help consumers, but actually exploit them to the extreme, would we still feel comfortable collecting the data that we're collecting right now? And if the answer is no, then you should probably go back to the drawing board and say, can we do better? And right, going back to the drawing board could mean many different things. That could mean, can we implement federated learning in a way that we don't have to collect the data, but still offer the same product? It could mean, can we at least involve the consumer in a way that makes it very obvious and a lot more bi-directional in terms of here's the data that we're collecting for this specific purpose. Now, it still means that you have to trust us with the data. So this would be the lowest hanging fruit, right? Making it a lot more obvious and trying to get real informed consent, not just you mindlessly ticking a box. But I love the Evil Steve test because it kind of takes account of the fact that even when we have the best intentions in the here and now, we're kind of forced to think about the future and think about a world in which that would just look very different. So that's one of the things, one of the examples that are easy to implement and I think can go a long way.
That's brilliant. I'm sure we can visualize and actually use it. I mean, and whatever your evil version is in your own company. Imagine you're an employee. You're not the boss of the company, but you're an employee and you're looking at your professional life, personal life. You're perhaps looking for a promotion and you're wondering, listening to this, thinking, is there anything I'm doing, saying, posting that perhaps could hit me in the face later on down the track? What are the practical nudges or tips you could give people as they're taking a fresh look at this topic, having listened to this and read your book? What should they be doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think so if the question is, what can we do to protect ourselves better, right, from our data being out there? I should say that I've become a lot more pessimistic over the years. So I think I would take me 10 years back. I was all about we should be making everything as transparent as possible. We should be giving consumers as much control as possible. And I do think we still need these steps, right? But it's the very minimum. It's like necessary, but it's not sufficient. Because what happens is like almost putting the burden on users just means that we're letting companies off the hook. And It's a burden that we're not really equipped to take on, right? So if you look to Europe with the European data protection regulations, or even California, which is very similar in that sense, it kind of assumes that we're all rational actors. We have all the knowledge that we need to understand technology, even though that moves at light speed. And I have no chance of keeping up, right? It's like I do this 24/7. I think about the topic all the time. It's almost impossible for me to keep up. And then I also assume that not just perfect knowledge, but also all the time in the world. Like even if you understand how technology works, it would still be more than a full-time job to now keep track of all of the traces that you generate. And as you mentioned, like if I'm worried that an employer is gonna look at what I post on social media and maybe they figure out that I'm not as organized and reliable as I should be. Well, that's just one data source, right? Oftentimes it's so easy for companies to get access to a lot more. And it's almost impossible to pretend that you're someone that you're not, right? If you think about this notion of you would have to, let's take this example of like being more organized than you really are. You can probably pull it off on social media for a while, but there's also all of these other traces. Like we know, for example, that if your phone keeps running out of battery all the time, that's a sign that you don't score high on conscientiousness. If you go to, like myself, if you go to the deli 3 times a day, because you can't even plan ahead for what's going to happen for dinner, also a sign that you're maybe not as conscientious. So if you really wanted to try and filter out some of the traits that you maybe not as fond of from all of the traces, it becomes an impossible job. So
Yes,
I think what we need is really these more systemic changes where we implement something like federated learning. It's not your job to say, how can I either trick the system or pretend that I'm someone that I'm not. What you should have is like your data should be protected. And then you should have the control and say, well, here's one of the traits, for example, let's take conscientiousness, that I don't want to be factored in when I get recommendations or when other people make decisions about what's happening in my life. And that would kind of take us to a completely new level. That would make it a lot easier for us to do the right thing than just making it transparent and then saying, now you go and manage your data.
I want to come back to the role of government and regulators in a moment, but yourself, you've been looking at this, as you say, 15 years, 24/7. That's interesting. I hope you sleep occasionally.
Yeah. It's like not with a baby anymore.
Especially with a young family, as I said. Yeah, I know that feeling. What's the biggest shift you've made on the basis of your own research? I always like to ask people if they practice what they preach. So what's the biggest, if it's not too personal?
Yeah. I mean, I think the reason for why I've become a lot more pessimistic, by the way, is observing myself. Because I know, like, I should be the first one to manage all of my cookies much more responsibly. I should be the first one to read all of the terms and conditions.
You should be the perfect role model on this, shouldn't you?
Exactly.
You know.
And I know, and still it's impossible, right? If I have to make the choice between spending a dinner with friends or my family or like reading these terms and conditions again of the product that I really want to use because I want to buy baby clothes, it's probably going to be the dinner. So I want to start there because I don't want to give the impression that it's easy for me and you just have to step up your game. Okay. I think it's an impossible task for everybody. The one thing that I probably do a little bit more mindful of than other people is the phone. Because there's like the phone for me is just so intimate because again, we kind of take it around with us 24/7. It can listen to everything that we do. And most people, and I constantly see this when other people download an app when I'm there, we just mindlessly accept all of the permissions, right? So you download a weather app and it taps into your photo gallery, it taps into your microphone, it taps into your GPS records. It doesn't need to. Most of the permissions apps don't need, and they're so intimate. And if you kind of make this distinction between Android and Apple at some point shuts down the tracking. So if you're not using an app anymore after a couple of hours, it says, well, that company doesn't need to track. And that app doesn't need to track all of your footprints. On Android, it's a free for all. Like once you've downloaded an app, you can track 24/7 for the rest of eternity. So just this is probably this one thing where I pay a little bit more attention than other people.
Well, it's refreshing to have some humility as well from such an esteemed academic and author. That's good. That's good too. I jest. That's good. Keep it going. I come back to you talk about obviously the changes in the data environment. That's the words you use in the book, and you referred to them there. I always ask the questions when there's such a potential harm in a system. Who acts first? Who acts together? So you say it's not up to individuals; it's just too big an ask. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's companies, regulators, governments, investors. What's the right combination and what sequence, and how should they do it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I do think that we actually need regulation because if you don't have any control over your data, all of the other solutions become really difficult, right? If in the US, there's places where I can't even get access to my own data that I generate, let alone ask other entities to delete it. So to me, that's a baseline. Now, again, I think we just need a lot more support to then say what happens after. And some of it might be driven by companies, right? So if you look to Apple, they got rid of the third-party tracking. Now, that's probably also a little bit self-interested in Apple's case, but still it had a huge impact on the entire ecosystem, right? Because a lot of third parties suddenly couldn't easily track your behavior across the web anymore. I also think that there's a good argument to be made for companies that collecting less data is actually more in many instances, because that's one of the questions that I oftentimes get is like, okay, if you don't want me to collect data, that's just going to destroy all of the value and we're not going to be able to compete in the market. Unless you're one of these companies that's in a business of selling data, then this isn't for you. But for most other companies, you're in a much better spot if you are able to use something like federated learning to give the same insights, right? So Apple Siri speech recognition is just as good being trained locally than it is being trained centrally on a server. And as a company, it's the risk of data breaches, of both financial risks, reputational risks, is much lower if you're not sitting on this pile of gold, right? Like if you're not collecting all of this data in a central place where now you have to protect it from these external attacks, which are just kind of blowing up in the last few years and decades, then you can offer the same service while not having this, again, financial and reputational risk. And you can also make it part of the value proposition to consumers, right? If you walk around New York, and you look at the Apple ads, it's all about Apple protecting your privacy. And obviously they're a B2C, so for them it's a lot easier to focus on that than, say, companies like Meta. But I think that there's something tangible in terms of business value that I think is probably going to push companies to enter that market at some point. So my hope is that it's this combination of regulators setting the stage and then companies who are leaders kind of taking advantage of the fact that they now have this regulation and saying we can do better and we can actually beat our competitors by following some of these steps.
Yeah, I love that. You love Apple, don't you? I do too, by the way. But no, I
mean, there's many issues with this, so I don't want to purely praise them, but there's certainly things that work well for the consumers with their products.
No, I hear you. I always like to delve into the individual in these podcasts, and that seems particularly appropriate in this conversation. Whether from your own self-awareness or from the insights you get from your own digital footprint, what is your what's your biggest superpower as an individual?
My biggest superpower, I would say it's curiosity. I just feel like curiosity is this one trait that helps in so many different contexts.
How does it show up? How does it show up? What do you do?
Shows up. So just the fact that I kind of love learning. So something like in research, right? Most of the time, what you're dealing with is negative feedback and critical feedback that's trying to take apart your work and your research, and it can be super devastating. I remember the early days, it was like one hit, you take one hit after the other onto your identity in a way. And I think this curiosity is what gets me through and keeps me excited about it. It's like, okay, actually, maybe I don't agree with all of the feedback, but there's something to it that might allow me to make the work that I do better. It's true with kids. I think that I just spent my weekend with my 1-year-old toddler who was sick. And, there's it could have been so boring because they don't do that much at that age. And I think just the curiosity of but he's actually picking up on this and maybe there's something that I can do. I think also got me through the personal challenges. I think curiosity really is probably the one thing that I would think
such a great mindset and a practice. It's both. Yeah. People talk about it in a loose term, but it's actually a practice. And what's your biggest weakness?
Definitely impatience. I was thinking about it as I talked about the curiosity. I think I'm very curious about stuff, but I also get impatient very quickly if I can't figure something out, for example. So then I just have to use the strength to find a new way that gets me excited.
That's again. A challenge in your field, given some the lead times on many things. I mean, it can be so glacial. Anyway, we're not talking about academia today. What about when you're having your best day? Just think about your best day, maybe today. When everything's going swimmingly, just performing your best, ideas are flowing, etc. What's the one practice? So what do you do to help fuel that best day?
I would say it's sleep, because I think sleep just seeps into everything that you do, which is becoming a lot harder to control. So in the absence of sleep, I actually think it's surrounding yourself with the people that can get you through the day. I think my best days, if I think about the most inspiring days that I have, it's always with other people. It's never the days that I sit in my office all by myself. So I think that's something we have perhaps a bit more control over than,
I love that.
Than sleep.
Yeah, I love that. And last but not least, a more philosophical question. What is the impact you're looking to have on the world around you through your work?
I think I want people to. That's actually why I wrote the book. I did not start with the idea of writing a book. I actually started writing these stories for my parents and my friends because I knew that they were not going to read the papers necessarily because they're not the most fun and engaging read. But I wanted them to care about their data a little bit more because even I know that I've said a lot about how it's hard to manage stuff at the individual level, but I do think we need the push, the collective demand for some of the things. So the idea of translating data into something that people can relate to was really hoping to get people to open people's eyes and say, look, this is something that we're all in together. And unless we all take action and we convince policymakers and we maybe demand more from companies when it comes to the way that they handle our data, we're never going to get there. So that was definitely one of the intentions, like one of the goals for writing the book.
Hats off to you. I mean, you're doing really important work. It's a riveting read, such an important topic, and you convey your points of conviction with real, I guess, a vividness, and it's very practical. It's very real and very personal as well. So that's fantastic. Where can people find out more about your work and you online when they want to?
Yeah, so there's a website for the book called mindmasters.ai. We also recently, actually with my husband, we started a center called the Center for Advanced Technology and Human Performance, which is trying to use technology in a way that helps people. So that's human-performance.ai.
Fantastic. You really do live and breathe this 24/7 with your work, your husband. Brilliant. Fantastic. Wonderful. I love the conversation. That was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please do check out the other episodes in this series. Sign up to the podcast, the YouTube channel. Give us a 5-star rating if you're feeling particularly generous. And Sandra, thank you ever so much again.
Thank you so much.